They laughed the first morning she laid the stakes, laughed with the dry-throated ease of men who had survived winters by taking from others and calling it wisdom, laughed because grief had made her thin and quiet, and because the land had already decided to test her. And as Martha Bell stood with frost stiffening the hem of her black dress, she felt the laughter settle into her bones like a second cold. A cold she had learned to live with since the night the river took Eli and gave him back as a name she spoke to the dark, and the men leaning on the hitching rail by Calder's store did not see what she saw when she looked across the bench above Juniper Draw, did not see the way the wind slid cleanly over the low ridge and broke itself there, did not hear the hush that came before snow when the land draws breath, and they did not know that the shape she marked in the dirt with her boot heel was not a joke, but a promise she had carried since girlhood, since her father set a lantern on the table and traced angles on a scrap of ledger paper while the blizzard worried the door, and he told her that cold is a creature that hates corners because corners give it a place to hide. And Martha, who had loved Eli for his gentleness and cursed him for the same, stood alone now with a borrowed hammer and a mind full of angles, and she let them laugh because she had learned that sound fades quicker than heat, and that survival is often a quiet thing done with hands that shake and do not stop. And the story of how a widow built an octagon cabin begins not with wood, but with the sound of laughter thinning as the day wore on, with men drifting back to their task as if embarrassed by the way her gaze did not leave the ground, and with the wind turning as if curious about her intention. And she worked until the sun slid low and the land took on that bruised color that meant night was coming hard. And when she drove the last stake and stepped back to look at the 8 equal sides, she felt a pulse in her chest that was not hope exactly, but a stubborn refusal to be undone by the shape of the world. And she slept that night in the lean-to by the creek with her coat folded under her head, listening to ice speak to itself, and dreamed of Eli standing at a door without hinges, his face both near and far saying nothing, which was how he had left her. And in the morning the cold came early, a gray veil over the draw, and she rose before dawn and began again, hauling logs from the timberline with a borrowed mule named Ash, whose ribs showed through his winter hair. And the men watched again, quieter now because there is something unsettling about a person who does not stop, and she measured and cut and fitted, her hands remembering what her father's hands had taught, how to seat a log so it leans into the next, how to let weight become strength. And she set each wall at a slight angle so the wind would not find a face to push against. And when the first snow came, it came, sideways and then straight down, thick as wool, and she worked through it until her fingers burned and then went numb and then burned again. And she sang to herself without words, the way she had sung to Eli when he coughed blood into a rag and told her it was nothing. And the octagon rose slow and sure, a low thing at first, then higher, the angles catching light in a way that made the cabin look as if it were turning its head, and Calder himself came out with his hands in his pockets and said, "Nothing," which was better than laughter. And when she set the roof timbers, she did it with care that bordered on reverence, bringing them together at a central ring she had carved from cottonwood, a circle within the angles, because circles keep heat the way grief keeps love. And she packed the chinks with clay and straw and old newspaper until the walls were thick and tight. And remember this, because it matters later. She left no square corner inside, rounding them with plaster so the cold would have nowhere to sit and gather. And she built a hearth not against a wall but near the center, a stone belly that would drink fire and give it back slowly. And she lined the floor with boards set on sleepers so the ground cold would have to work to find her feet. And when at last she stood inside the finished cabin, with snow sifting down through the smoke hole like a benediction, she felt the shape of it wrap around her, 8 sides holding her like hands. And she wept then, a sudden thing that left her shaking, because building had kept the grief at bay, and now it came in, but it came into a place that could hold it. And winter did not wait for her to finish grieving. Winter came with teeth. The creek froze solid, the draw filled, the sky went hard and bright, and stayed that way for days until the stars rang. And the men who had laughed now watched their breath inside their square houses, and cursed the drafts that found every corner and crevice. And Martha learned the truth of what she had built not by theory, but by waking in the dark to find the air around her still and soft, her breath a small cloud that did not linger. The fire banked low, and yet the stone warmed to the touch. And she sat up and pressed her palm to the wall and felt a gentle return, as if the cabin remembered her. And she marked the temperature, not with a gauge, but with her bones, with the way her joints did not scream, with the way her tea did not skin over in minutes. And when the storm of December came, the one that buried fences and took 2 calves and nearly took Calder's boy when he went out without a rope. Martha's octagon stood and shrugged, the wind sliding, the snow piling evenly around it, insulating it further, and she spent 3 days inside with Ash in a small shed she had built against the lee side, sharing the quiet with the fire and the thought she could not outrun, thinking of Eli's laugh, the way it had surprised her the first time because it was lighter than she expected from a man with such broad shoulders, thinking of the night he had stood at the river and said it would be quick, thinking of the way water makes its own shapes and how those shapes do not care who they take. And on the 4th day she dug out and found the world changed, white and bright, known and unknown at once. And the men came then, not laughing, asking questions that were half jokes and half hope. And she answered them plainly because there was no triumph in it for her, only the relief of a place that did not betray her. And they said things about 55 degrees warmer, and she shrugged because numbers meant little to her compared to the feel of it. But she did not miss the way their eyes lingered on her cabin, on the angles, on the hearth, on the absence of frost inside the windows, and she did not miss the way Calder's eyes went calculating. And winter deepened, and with it came hunger. And a man named Rourke came to her door one night with his hat in his hands and a story about a sick wife and a child and a house that would not hold heat, no matter how they stuffed it. And Martha let him sit by the fire and gave him stew, and listened to the way his words went around the truth. And she felt the pull of her own need to keep what she had built safe, because the world had taught her that sharing can become a wound. But she also felt the old pull her father had named and that Eli had lived, the pull to do what keeps you human even when it costs. And she told Rourke what she had done about angles and thickness and hearths, and he listened like a drowning man listens to a rope, and he went away changed, and the laughter did not return, but something else did, something sharper, a sense that what she had made was not just shelter but difference, and difference draws attention in a place where sameness keeps you alive. And when the snow fell again and the nights went longer, Martha began to notice tracks that did not belong, boot prints near her shed, a drag mark where something heavy had been pulled and then lifted, and she slept lighter, a rifle by the bed, the fire banked higher than she liked because warmth can make you careless. And one evening as she stood at the hearth feeding the stones, she heard a sound that was not wind and not animal, a sound like wood complaining under a weight that knew where to press, and she felt the cabin answer, a subtle settling as if bracing itself. And she understood then that building is a kind of vow, and that vows are tested, and outside the night pressed close, full of breath and intent, and Martha Bell stood in the center of her octagon, the firelight turning the angles into moving shadows, and waited for whatever had decided that her warmth was something to be taken, knowing as she listened that winter was not done with her, and that the shape she had chosen would have to prove itself against more than cold. The sound came again, closer this time, not the wild scraping of weather, but the deliberate testing of a hand that believed wood would give if pressed the right way. And Martha felt fear then, real and sharp, but beneath it ran a steadier current, the knowledge that she had already chosen her answer months ago when she cut the first angle and refused the easy shape. And she did not shout or rush to the door, but stood still and let the cabin speak back, because the octagon did not echo the way square rooms do, sound bending and softening, and whoever was outside would not know where she stood. And when the knock came, it was not a knock at all, but a shoulder set against the door, a grunt, and then a curse as the door held and gave nothing back, and she said, clear and even, that whoever it was should step into the light of the lantern if they wanted to be known. And there was a pause long enough for the fire to sigh and settle, and then Rourke stepped forward, his face cut with cold, and something worse, shame maybe. And behind him stood Calder and 2 others, their eyes bright with hunger that had learned to dress itself as reason. And Calder said words about community and fairness, and how no one woman should have what others lacked when winter was this cruel. And Martha listened, because listening cost less than speaking, and she thought of her father drawing angles, of Eli standing at the river, of the night she had slept cold because she believed endurance was the same as virtue. And when Calder finished, she said quietly that she had shared what she knew and that knowledge was lighter to carry than wood, and that if they wanted warmth, they could build it. But she would not give up the only place that kept her alive. And Calder smiled then, a thin thing, and said they could talk it through inside where it was warm. And that was when Martha lifted the rifle and rested it in the crook of her arm, not as a threat, but as a fact. And she saw the calculation shift, saw them look at the door again, at the way the hinges were set inward, at the way the walls leaned, and the octagon did what it had been built to do. It made no side a clear invitation. And the men retreated a step, and the night rushed in to fill the space they left. And Rourke spoke then, voice rough, saying that this was wrong, that taking would not fix what cold had broken. And Calder rounded on him, and the argument flared and burned itself out quick, because winter does not wait for men to agree. And at last they left, their footsteps loud in the snow, and Martha barred the door and sat with her back to it until dawn, the fire steady, the stones giving back what they had taken. And in the morning she found the tracks gone, filled in by new snow, as if the land itself had decided not to remember, and the rest of winter passed not easy but honest, the octagon holding, neighbors building their own versions with mixed success, learning that shape is only one part of survival, and patience another. And when spring came slow and late, and the creek spoke again, Martha opened the door and let the light in, and felt something like peace settle where grief had been, not because loss had ended, but because it had been answered with work and will. And when people asked later how she had done it, she said only that cold has habits, and so do people, and you live by choosing which habits you'll face and which you'll refuse. And if this story has held you, if you felt the weight of that winter and the warmth that came from stubborn choices, then remember that every tale told here is built the same way, with care, with angles meant to keep the cold out, and with fire at the center. So stay with the Western Tales, subscribe, remember these stories, and carry them forward, because the Old West was not made by laughter or cruelty, but by those who chose to endure and build anyway.